In this video, we're going to discuss the major body cavities and the serous membranes. So you have additional smaller body cavities like the oral cavity and the orbital cavity, but today we're going to focus on the major cavities of the body. So you have two major cavities, the dorsal, which if you remember from our directions, dorsal means toward the back, right, or posterior, and then the ventral cavity, which is the anterior cavity or towards the front of the body. We're going to start with the dorsal cavity. So this one is completely enclosed by bone, and it can be subdivided into two cavities, the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. Now the cranial cavity is enclosed by the cranium. This is where our brain is housed. And the vertebral cavity is enclosed by the vertebral column. This is where the spinal cord is going to be found. Now, the cranial cavity and vertebral cavity, as you can see here, these are continuous with one another. So this is the dorsal body cavity, right? Dorsal can be subdivided into the cranial, which houses the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which houses the spinal cord. The larger of the two cavities is the ventral cavity. This one is not enclosed by bone as we saw in the dorsal cavity, and the ventral cavity is going to have serous membranes that surround and protect the viscera or the organs in this cavity. Now, the serous membranes, as we'll look in a minute, they provide protection, they help with compartmentalization. They also contain a fluid-filled space to reduce friction, because if we think about it, we have organs that expand and contract. So when you breathe, your lungs are going to expand. When your bladder fills up with urine, it's going to stretch and expand. Now, the ventral cavity, and we'll look at a figure in just a minute, but it can be further subdivided into the thoracic cavity. This is contained by the rib cage. It's going to have the lungs and the heart in this cavity. There is an area of the thoracic cavity called the mediastinum or the mediastinum. And the thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal pelvic cavity by your diaphragm muscle. Now, the abdominal pelvic cavity can further be subdivided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Notice the name abdominopelvic. However, there is not any kind of muscle or membrane separating the abdominal and the pelvic cavities. Now let's take a look at this on a figure. So on the left side, we've already looked at the dorsal cavity, right? We covered that, the cranial and the vertebral. Now we're going to focus on the ventral cavity. So if we look at from the figure on the right, this entire area, right, is going to be contained in the ventral body cavity. Now, the ventral body cavity, we can further subdivide into the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity, if we see here, is the one that's in purple, okay? So we could circle that thoracic cavity there. And then the abdominopelvic cavity below is separated by the diaphragm from the thoracic cavity. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity can further be subdivided into the abdominal cavity, which is shown in pink, and the pelvic cavity, which is shown in green. Now, let's think about for just a second, if we look at the thoracic cavity. Within the thoracic cavity, we see that we have two pleural cavities. Now, the pleural cavities are those that contain the lungs. And if we think about left and right in this particular image, we know that as we're looking at the person, okay, this would be the left side and this would be the right side. So this particular cavity here would be the right pleural cavity. This one would be the left pleural cavity. In between the two pleural cavities, we see shown in sort of that turquoise color or teal color, the pericardial cavity or the pericardium. Now, let me change colors here. Let's do this. This particular area here that contains the pericardium, and this area called the mediastinum. That is all the mediastinum. So part of the mediastinum is going to contain the pericardium where the heart is found. Now we have a diaphragm that's separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. But if we think about a particular organ that we would find in the abdominal cavity, let's say the liver. The liver then is in the ventral cavity, right? The liver is also in the abdominal pelvic cavity, and the liver is found in the abdominal cavity. Now let's walk through these two main cavities. Okay, so we have the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. And the dorsal cavity is further divided into the cranial cavity and the spinal or the vertebral cavity. And we could actually indicate on there within the cranial cavity, right? We know this houses the brain. And the vertebral or spinal cavity is going to house the spinal cord. Now, the ventral cavity can be divided into the thoracic cavity, which is above or superior to the diaphragm, and the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is inferior to the diaphragm. Now we can further subdivide the thoracic cavity into the two pleural cavities, the left and right pleural cavity, and the mediastinum. Now, we think here within the pleural cavity, right, we have the lungs. Then the mediastinum contains the pericardial cavity, the pericardium. The mediastinum is also going to have, we'll talk about this as we go through the semester, we'll learn more about the organs and where they're found, but excuse me. The mediastinum is going to contain the trachea and the esophagus. The pericardial cavity or the pericardium is going to have the heart. And it's going to have what we call the great vessels, which we'll talk about more. These are the large blood vessels that are leaving and entering into the heart. Now, we have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can also be subdivided into the abdominal and the pelvic cavities. Now, within the abdominal area, the abdominal cavity, we have different organs. So, for example, we have the liver, we have the stomach, we have the pancreas, we have the intestines, we have the kidneys, we have the spleen, and then within the pelvic cavity, we find the bladder, and we find the reproductive organs. So that's just one way that you can kind of make sense of the different cavities. So for example, if we look at the heart, okay, the heart is in the ventral cavity, the heart is in the thoracic cavity, the heart is in the pericardial cavity. Now let's shift gears and talk about serous membranes. Remember, these are found in the ventral cavity. Now these are going to cover the walls and organs of the body. As I mentioned to you, they contain some fluid, a fluid-filled space that's going to help reduce friction. There are two layers to serous membranes. The parietal layer is going to line the wall of the cavity, and the visceral layer is going to line the actual organs. Now, organs are also called viscera. So the visceral layer is deep to the parietal layer of the serous membranes. Between these two layers is a fluid-filled space called the serous cavity. So we spoke about this a little bit. There are 3 serous cavities in the ventral cavity, and the pleural cavity, surrounds the lung. So the pleura would be the actual serous membranes that encloses the pleural cavity. The pericardial cavity is that surrounds the heart. So the pericardium would be the serous membrane that encloses that pericardial cavity around the heart. And the peritoneal cavity is the one that surrounds the organs in the whole abdominopelvic cavity. Remember, there isn't a defining structure that separates the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity. So the peritoneum would be the serous membrane that encloses that cavity. Okay, now we're going to focus on the serous membranes. Now remember, these are found within the ventral cavity, and we're going to look at the heart. So this is an example. What I want you to see is there is going to be two different layers to this membrane. One layer is going to actually be against the viscera or the organ, so in this case the heart. So this layer, I'll just highlight it, that's against the organ, in this case the heart, is called the visceral layer. Now, because we're talking about the heart, it's the visceral pericardium. Now, the other layer that would be external to that, so this outer layer, okay, this is going to be the parietal layer. And so we're talking about the heart, so it's the parietal pericardium. Now, the space that's in between those two layers, okay, so all of this space in here, this is a fluid-filled space. This is the pericardial cavity. So this is actually what we would consider the pericardial cavity. Now, if we're talking about the lungs, we would have the same situation. We would have a visceral layer that was next to the lungs. Then we would have a space, and you would have that external layer, the parietal layer. But if we were talking about the lungs, let's just write it here. The lungs, okay, the layer next to the lungs would be the visceral pleura, because it would be around the lungs. And then we would have the pleural cavity, and then the external layer would be the parietal, which means wall, parietal pleura. So the same thing in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Remember that we don't have a structure that actually separates those. So the peritoneum is the serous membrane that is found in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And we would have the same thing. We would have the visceral peritoneum, which would be against the organ. We would have the parietal peritoneum, which would be the external layer. And then the cavity in between would be the peritoneal cavity.